The 6th anniversary of the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School is coming up this Friday. 21st graders and 6 adults, as you may remember, they were killed on that horrific day. And now we are learning quite a bit more about the shooter, Adam Lanza. The Hartford Courant obtained more than 1,000 pages of documents that show how troubled Lanza was and how he was on the radar of parents, teachers, counselors, and psychiatrists from the time that he was 3 years old. He was recluse, never able to get along with peers, started when he was a small child. As he got older, he was diagnosed with everything from OCD to autism and also severe developmental problems, including the inability to speak. During an evaluation at the Yale Child Center when he was 14, psychiatrists thought all of that isolation could be, quote, catastrophic. Current details an encounter with a psychiatrist at Yale. The doctor asked, "Are there kids you enjoy spending time with?" To that, a young Lanza answered, "Why would that be significant? What is a friend?" Psychiatrist asked Lanza that question, to which he said, "It is difficult to define. In whose culture do you refer?" He answered robotically. And if he was asked if he had 3 wishes, what would they be? He'd say, "I'd wish that whatever was granting me, those wishes would not exist." Now, that was far from the only red flag. When Lanza was in 5th grade, he wrote a children's book about a murderous grandmother. It's extremely violent, and one scene has that character slaughtering people on the set of a show called Grandma's Clubhouse for Happy Children. I'm going to quote here from The Current once again. Investigators from the Child Advocate's Office, in their report, they pointed to the Granny book as a giant missed opportunity to find out why Lanza was so easily able to conceptualize violent acts and draw them out in his stories until blood was shed. This fixation, it only festered as he got older and angrier and became even more isolated. He was also an incessant gamer, locking himself into a dark room, playing video games for all hours. He communicated online with other gamers. Here, one quote, "I incessantly have nothing other than scorn for humanity. I've been desperate to feel anything positive for someone for my entire life." He meticulously compiled spreadsheets of mass murderers dating all the way back to 1786, included weapons used, numbers of people killed and wounded, time, place, and fate of shooter. Experts say Lanza was creating a roadmap to murder, and the paper wrote in an op-ed why it's releasing all of this information it's obtained now. And I want to read finally a portion of it. The state hid the writings, records, and reports not just from the press, but from the researchers, experts, and clinicians who could have learned more about what early warning signs might have been missed, what educators and clinicians need to pay attention to when dealing with angry, lonely children, what prevention strategies might be helpful in preventing another such tragedy from ever happening again. And joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty. She represents Connecticut's 5th District, which contains Sandy Hook. And I want to talk in a minute about your efforts over the last 6 years to try and bring some meaningful gun reform and maybe some hopes you have on the front going forward. But with what we've learned even more, and seemingly a lot of opportunities missed, somewhere in this country there's probably some troubled person where people have different pieces to a story that they haven't connected the dots, that maybe if they do, a tragedy will be prevented. What do we have to do that we can't do now to prevent such a horrific tragedy that Connecticut experienced those years ago?
Well, Richard, I really am glad that you are shining a light on this as we come up to the 6th-year anniversary of just this horrible, tragic event that not only affected Newtown, but really the nation and the world. I'll tell you, there's actually a lot of effort that's underway right now, because at the end of the day, we know Americans are no more mentally ill than other countries. And yet we have a gun rate that is hundreds or thousands of times higher. So that the real issue is we need to get guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Now, Connecticut now has an extreme risk protective order that allows families the tools, and others who would have reason to know someone like a young Adam Lanza, to be able to go to court and ensure that this person guns are removed from the household. And that's something we're fighting for at the federal level, and I think there's a really good opportunity for that sort of legislation to pass.
I'd imagine, though, and I speak for myself, in the end, the shooter bears accountability for what he did. I can argue the mother allowing those guns to be in the household certainly bears some responsibility. But all that said, I would just imagine, Congresswoman, if I was a parent and I lost my child or I lost a loved one that day, I'd say, who's going to connect the dots the next time this happens? Is that a fair question, in that different groups had different pieces of the information. Is there a way, without violating a person's privacy rights, that we can have a more comprehensive picture of troubled people?
Well, I think there is, in fact, a lot of effort that's being done exactly on that front, not just from this situation, but others we've seen as well. Because, again, we know folks with mental health issues are actually way more likely to hurt themselves. Of the 30,000 plus gun deaths a year, 2/3 are suicides. So although what makes the top of the news are the horrific mass shootings that certainly Newtown represents and Parkland this year, in fact, for folks suffering with mental illness, they are most likely to take their own lives. And that's part of what we need to be identifying too.
The state of Connecticut, the state of New York, other states have made progress as it relates after these tragedies to restrict guns to those or have better databases, et cetera. But on the federal level, there's been a ton of frustration, and not through any shortage of efforts by yourselves and others. You, however, feel hopeful that in the new Congress, with a different majority in the House and maybe a greater appetite in the Senate, there actually could be meaningful reform as it relates to guns and access to people who shouldn't have them?
I really do. And I'll tell you, Richard, we saw the American people voting on gun safety as a major issue. So I've talked to many of the new members who are arriving in Congress, getting sworn in next month, and they are committed to try to do something. Yesterday, our task force met with Jerry Nadler, who is the incoming head of the Judiciary Committee, and plotting out already, laying out what's the legislation that people are going to be teeing up. Well over 90%, in the high 90s, of American people support universal background checks, for example. That is even higher than it was in the wake of Newtown 6 years ago. We've seen other attitudes change. People really support reducing magazine size, those big extended magazines that can hold 30, 40, 50 or more bullets at once. And there is discussion about potentially an assault weapon ban. That was considered undoable a few years ago. But we heard from voters, a lot of voters, particularly in the wake of Parkland, who believe that that is such a common element in the mass shootings that this is something we should be looking at.
Congresswoman Esty, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
In coming days, we will continue to talk about Sandy Hook. We're going to speak with other lawmakers and also a psychiatric expert about the ethical limits that they face and how they deal with law enforcement when they see red flags. When we come back, a lot of fireworks at the first public hearing about Amazon's deal to come to New York City. We were there, we got all the action. That's straight ahead.